Caroline Grant, a seasoned flight attendant with a no-nonsense approach to her job, makes a grave mistake when she misjudges and humiliates a passenger in first class. What she doesn't know is that this unassuming traveler, David Harris, is the new owner of SkyPath Airlines, a man who's been quietly observing the cracks in the airline's culture. But instead of seeking retribution, David sees an opportunity to create something bigger. He launches an ambitious program to address systemic biases and foster empathy, pulling Caroline into the heart of the initiative. As Caroline faces the consequences of her actions, she is forced to confront her own prejudices and transform in ways she never imagined. With tensions rising among the crew, pushback from skeptical colleagues, and the weight of her past looming over her, Caroline's journey is anything but smooth. And just when progress seems within reach, a revelation threatens to shake her resolve and the program to its core. Can Caroline rise above her mistakes to become a leader of change? Will David's vision for a better airline survive the turbulence of resistance? Caroline Grant adjusted her uniform, smoothing down the crisp edges as she prepared to greet the first-class passengers. She had worked for SkyPath Airlines for over a decade and had earned a reputation for upholding high standards. To her, first class wasn't just a section of the plane, it was a symbol of excellence, and she ensured it stayed that way. As passengers began boarding, her sharp eyes caught a man who seemed out of place. He was older, dressed in a simple gray suit, with a scuffed leather briefcase in hand. His demeanor was quiet, almost reserved, as he settled into seat 1A. Caroline frowned, her practiced smile faltering for a moment. Something about him didn't fit. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her tone polite but edged with skepticism. "Are you sure you're in the right cabin?" The man looked up, his kind eyes meeting hers. "Yes, this is my seat," he said simply. Her smile tightened. "I'll need to see your ticket." The passenger complied without hesitation, handing over his boarding pass. Caroline scrutinized it closely, holding it up to the light as though it might reveal a hidden forgery. "It's valid," she admitted, her voice begrudging. But her expression didn't soften. "Perhaps you meant to book economy?" The man raised an eyebrow, but his tone remained calm. "There's no mistake. I belong here." Caroline's frustration simmered beneath the surface. This wasn't the first time she had encountered someone who didn't fit her image of first class, and her instinct was to enforce the unspoken rules she believed in. The cabin grew quiet as passengers watched the interaction. Finally, the man broke the tension. "If there's nothing else, I'd like to settle in." Caroline nodded stiffly and walked away, but her unease lingered. The flight progressed smoothly until a brief moment of turbulence caused Caroline to check on the first-class cabin again. As she passed seat 1A, the passenger glanced up. "Do you know if the plane will land on time?" he asked, his tone calm but curious. Caroline, already irritated, misinterpreted his question as criticism. "Sir, we're doing everything we can to ensure the flight remains on schedule," she snapped. When the passenger's calm expression didn't falter, something inside Caroline snapped. "If you're unhappy, perhaps first class isn't the right fit for you," she added, her voice cold. Before she could think twice, she made a mistake that would haunt her. Her hand flew up and struck his cheek, a brief, impulsive slap that echoed through the cabin. A stunned silence followed. The man's hand went to his cheek as he turned to face her, shock flickering in his eyes. Caroline stumbled backward, realizing what she had done. Before she could stammer an apology, the man took out his phone, reading a quiet notification. His lips twitched into the faintest smile, but he said nothing. Unknown to Caroline, this passenger wasn't just anyone. David Harris, a billionaire philanthropist, had just finalized the purchase of SkyPath Airlines. What began as a strategic investment had turned into something personal, and now his first encounter with his new company was anything but ordinary. Instead of making a scene, David sat back and allowed the flight to continue. Observing Caroline and the rest of the crew, he noted how the team responded not just to him, but to every passenger. Patterns emerged. He saw Caroline's cold demeanor toward certain travelers, her warmth reserved for those who fit a specific mold. David wasn't angry. He was curious. By the time the plane landed, he had already decided what his next steps would be. David Harris exited the plane without a word to the crew, his calm demeanor masking the swirl of thoughts racing through his mind. This flight, meant to be a quiet observation of his new investment, had turned into something far more revealing. Skypath Airlines wasn't just flawed, it was fractured. Caroline Grant's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger problem. Discrimination and bias weren't just tolerated. They thrived in the absence of accountability. As David stepped into the terminal, his assistant Laura approached with a tablet in hand. "The acquisition went through smoothly," Laura said, falling into step beside him. "We officially own a majority stake in Skypath Airlines." David nodded. "Good. We've got work to do starting now." Laura glanced at him, sensing the weight in his tone. "What happened on the flight?" "Let's just say I got an unfiltered look at our company's culture," David replied, his voice measured. "Prepare a report on passenger complaints and staff conduct. Focus on recurring names, particularly in first class." Laura's fingers flew across her tablet. "And the flight attendant involved?" David paused, his jaw tightening. "Not yet. I want to understand the full scope before we address her directly. But make no mistake, this isn't about one person. This is systemic." Behind the scenes, David's team worked swiftly. Passenger complaints, employee evaluations, and HR records were pulled and analyzed. Patterns emerged, just as David had suspected. Caroline's name appeared in several reports, but so did others. Incidents of bias, from subtle dismissiveness to outright hostility, painted a damning picture. In one particularly troubling case, an elderly black woman wrote about being ignored while struggling with her carry-on bag. Caroline's name appeared again, along with a description of another passenger stepping in to help. David's lips pressed into a thin line as he read the complaint. He remembered that moment vividly. He had been that passenger. Meanwhile, Caroline was struggling to focus. The days since the flight had been tense, and the weight of her actions bore down on her. Though no formal complaint had reached her yet, whispers among her colleagues hinted that something was brewing. Lisa, her closest confidant, found her in the break room. "You okay?" Lisa asked, concern etched on her face. Caroline shook her head. "I don't know. Something feels off. Everyone's been watching me." Lisa hesitated. "Well, there's been talk about your flight with that guy in first class." Caroline stiffened. "Talk? What kind of talk?" Lisa shrugged uncomfortably. "Just that he might have been someone important. A big deal." Caroline's heart sank. "Who is he?" "No one knows for sure," Lisa admitted. "But I heard someone say he was asking a lot of questions. About complaints, about policies, like he was taking notes." Caroline's mind raced. What if he had been more than just a passenger? The following week, an email circulated among the staff. Mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all employees. Caroline read the announcement with a sinking feeling. She had never attended such a session before. It was always for problematic staff. But now, it was company-wide. Her suspicions grew when her supervisor, Mark, pulled her aside. "You've been assigned to the first session," he said. "It's not optional." Caroline forced a smile, though her mind was spinning. Of course, anything to support the company. But as she left Mark's office, her confidence wavered. Why was she being singled out? And who had ordered this sudden overhaul? As the first training session began, Caroline entered the room filled with her peers. The atmosphere was uneasy, a mix of curiosity and apprehension. At the front of the room stood Melissa, the cheerful trainer, alongside a familiar face, David Harris. Caroline's breath caught in her throat. Melissa introduced him casually, as if his presence were routine. And this is Mr. Harris, one of our senior stakeholders. He'll be observing today's session. David's gaze swept the room, landing briefly on Caroline. He offered a polite nod but said nothing. The session began, focusing on scenarios designed to highlight implicit bias. Caroline participated stiffly, her discomfort growing with every exercise. When the floor was opened for discussion, she stayed silent, hoping to avoid further attention. But then Melissa called on her. "Caroline, what's your perspective on this scenario? How would you have handled it differently?" All eyes turned to her. Caroline's heart raced as she searched for a response. David's calm, unreadable expression felt like a spotlight on her. I think it's important to listen to passengers," she said finally, her voice faltering. "Sometimes we make assumptions that aren't fair." Melissa nodded encouragingly, but Caroline could sense the tension in the room. David spoke for the first time. And what happens when those assumptions cause harm? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Caroline didn't answer. As the session ended, Caroline lingered in the room, unsure of whether to approach David or avoid him. Before she could decide, he walked over to her. "You've got potential," he said quietly. "But potential means nothing without accountability." Caroline nodded, unsure how to respond. "This isn't the end of the conversation," David added. "It's the beginning." Caroline watched as he walked away, her mind swirling. For the first time, she realized that her journey wasn't just about survival, it was about transformation. Caroline couldn't shake the weight of David Harris's words. "This isn't the end of the conversation, it's the beginning." They lingered like an unwelcome shadow as she returned to her usual routes, each interaction with passengers suddenly under her own harsh scrutiny. Her colleagues were quieter around her, some avoiding eye contact altogether. The tension wasn't overt, but it was palpable, a quiet shift that left Caroline feeling isolated. She tried to focus on her duties, but the edges of her confidence were fraying. On a late-night flight to Chicago, she caught herself hesitating when a young black woman asked for assistance with her bag. Normally, Caroline would have ignored the request or deflected it to another crew member. This time, she forced a smile and stepped forward. "Let me help," she said, her tone lighter than usual. The woman looked surprised but grateful. "Thank you," she said softly. The exchange was small, almost insignificant, yet it left Caroline unsettled. While Caroline wrestled with her own transformation, David was deep in the trenches of reform. The more he uncovered, the clearer the airline's systemic problems became. In a private meeting with Nora Hill, his chief of operations, David reviewed the latest findings from the investigation. A series of complaints outlined a pattern of discriminatory behavior among certain staff. Most were dismissed with generic responses, while others had been buried entirely. "Why hasn't this been addressed?" David asked, his tone calm but firm. Nora sighed. "Lack of oversight, complacency, maybe fear of shaking things up. But it's clear this culture was allowed to fester." David leaned back in his chair, his mind already crafting a plan. "We can't just issue new policies and hope for the best. Change has to come from the ground up. Start with the hiring process, then retrain the existing staff." "And Caroline?" Nora asked carefully. David's expression didn't waver. "She's still part of this. If she can change, it proves that anyone can. But she'll need more than training. She'll need to see the consequences of her actions firsthand." Nora raised an eyebrow. "You're thinking of pairing her with passengers, aren't you?" David smiled faintly. "The ones who filed the most impactful complaints. Let's see how she handles facing the people she's wronged." Caroline's latest schedule came with an unexpected addition. A week-long series of flights assigned specifically to accommodate elderly passengers and families with young children. These routes were known for their challenges, language barriers, mobility issues, and a higher volume of requests. Caroline frowned as she reviewed the assignment. "This has to be a mistake," she muttered, approaching her supervisor, Mark. "It's not a mistake," Mark said flatly. "You've been flagged for cultural sensitivity development. These routes are part of your program." Caroline's stomach tightened. She opened her mouth to protest, but stopped. This wasn't a battle she could win. The first flight was chaotic from the start. A large family with multiple children struggled to settle into their seats. An elderly man with a cane needed extra time boarding, holding up the aisle. Caroline's patience wore thin as she juggled requests for extra pillows, drink refills, and baggage assistance. Her instinct was to delegate the more challenging passengers to other crew members, but every time she considered it, she remembered David's words. By the time the flight landed, she was exhausted, but oddly reflective. She had managed to assist every passenger without losing her temper or making dismissive remarks, a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. At the end of the route, Caroline was tasked with handling a special guest, an elderly black woman who required extra care during the boarding process. As the woman approached, Caroline's chest tightened. She recognized her immediately. It was the same woman from the complaint David had referenced during the training session, the one whose carry-on bag Carolyn had ignored. The woman smiled warmly, but Caroline could see the flicker of hesitation in her eyes. "Good afternoon, dear," the woman said, her voice soft but steady. Caroline swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Welcome aboard," she managed, forcing a smile. Throughout the flight, Caroline went out of her way to ensure the woman was comfortable. She adjusted her seat, offered extra snacks, and helped her disembark when they landed. As they parted, the woman placed a gentle hand on Caroline's arm. "Thank you," she said simply. Caroline felt a lump form in her throat. "You're welcome," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. That night, Caroline sat in her apartment, replaying the day's events. For the first time, she felt something shift within her, not guilt or shame, but the smallest spark of hope. She opened her notebook and began jotting down ideas for ways the airline could better support its passengers. Her handwriting was shaky, but her determination was growing. Caroline couldn't stop thinking about the elderly passenger from the flight. The woman's gentle gratitude had lingered, but beneath it, Caroline sensed something deeper, a quiet strength born from years of weathering small injustices. For the first time, Caroline began to wonder how often passengers like her had been overlooked, dismissed, or treated unfairly. She brought this unease with her to the next team meeting for the Cultural Sensitivity Initiative. The group had gathered to evaluate their progress and refine future training sessions. Caroline sat at the table, listening as others shared ideas, her mind still on the notebook of suggestions she'd jotted down the night before. Marcus, one of the trainers, glanced at her. "Caroline, you've been working directly with the passengers. Any insights you'd like to share?" The room turned to her, and for a moment, Caroline hesitated. She wasn't used to being asked for her opinion, let alone in a group that still harbored doubts about her. But she took a deep breath and spoke. "I've realized we focus a lot on policies, but what really matters are the small moments," she said. "Passengers notice when we take the time to listen, or when we make assumptions about them. Those moments shape their entire experience." Marcus raised an eyebrow, surprised. "And how do you think we address that?" Caroline swallowed hard, knowing her next words would expose her vulnerability. "We need more empathy. And not just for the passengers, for the crew, too. I think a lot of these issues come from stress, fear of making mistakes, and lack of understanding. If we create space for people to connect, maybe we can start breaking down those walls." The room was silent, but not with the tension Caroline had feared. Marcus nodded slowly, and a few others murmured in agreement. David, who had been quietly observing, leaned forward. "What would that look like in practice?" he asked. Caroline met his gaze, her nerves momentarily faltering. Workshops where staff can share their own stories, role-playing that isn't just about rules, but about seeing things from a different perspective. Maybe even pairing staff with passengers who filed complaints so they can understand the impact firsthand. David's expression remained unreadable, but his tone was thoughtful. Interesting. Let's explore that. 2 weeks later, Caroline found herself standing in front of a group of employees for a new workshop she had helped design. She hadn't expected to lead it, but when Marcus fell ill, the responsibility fell squarely on her shoulders. The group included flight attendants, gate agents, and even a few supervisors. Among them were faces Caroline recognized, some skeptical, others curious. She felt their judgment like a weight, but pushed through it. "Before we start," Caroline said, her voice steady despite her nerves, "I want to share something personal. A few months ago, I made a mistake, a big one. I let my assumptions about a passenger guide my actions, and I hurt someone who didn't deserve it." She paused, scanning the room. "I've been working to make amends ever since. But what I've realized is that making amends isn't just about saying sorry. It's about changing the way we see and treat others." The group listened in silence as she guided them through exercises she had once struggled with herself. Role-playing scenarios, reflection questions, and open discussions filled the session. Slowly, the room began to soften. As the workshop wrapped up, David entered the room. His presence caused a ripple of whispers, but he quickly waved them off. "I'm just here to observe," he said with a faint smile. Caroline couldn't help but tense under his gaze, but she pressed on, inviting feedback from the group. One participant, a young gate agent, raised her hand. "I didn't realize how much impact a single interaction could have until today," she said. "It's made me think about the way I approach passengers, especially the ones I've been quick to judge." David nodded approvingly. "That's exactly what we're aiming for." As the group dispersed, David approached Caroline. "You handled that well," he said. "Thank you," she replied, her voice tinged with surprise. David's gaze softened. "This is what leadership looks like, Caroline, taking responsibility and guiding others to do the same. Keep it up." Caroline watched him leave, a strange mix of pride and determination settling over her. For the first time, she believed she could truly make a difference. Caroline left the training center feeling a mixture of pride and exhaustion. The workshop had gone better than she'd expected, but the effort of laying herself bare still weighed heavily on her. As she walked to her car, she replayed David's words. This is what leadership looks like. For someone who had spent years building walls between herself and others, the idea of leading through vulnerability felt foreign. But for the first time, she began to wonder if those walls had been more of a hindrance than a shield. The next morning, an email from David's assistant landed in Caroline's inbox. The subject line read, "Special Assignment, Passenger Reconciliation Program." Curious and a little apprehensive, Caroline opened the message. It outlined a new initiative. Staff members with past complaints would meet directly with passengers who had raised those concerns. The goal was to foster understanding and, if possible, repair the damage caused. Caroline's heart sank when she saw her name listed alongside the first assignment. The passenger? An elderly black woman who had filed a formal complaint about being ignored during a flight months ago. Her chest tightened. She remembered the incident vividly, not because of the complaint, but because David had been on that same flight. The memory of her indifference, the way she had turned her back on the woman, stung more now than it had then. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon at a quiet cafe near the airport. Caroline arrived early, her nerves gnawing at her as she rehearsed what she would say. She had spent the previous night reviewing the woman's complaint, trying to anticipate her questions. When the woman arrived, Caroline stood to greet her. She was elegant and composed, her silver hair pulled into a neat bun. Her warm smile, though faint, instantly disarmed Caroline. "Mrs. Turner," Caroline said, extending a hand. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Please, call me Rose, the woman replied as they sat down. For a moment, the two women sat in silence, the hum of the cafe filling the space between them. Finally, Caroline spoke. I want to start by saying I'm sorry, she said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. When you asked for help on that flight, I ignored you. I made assumptions that were wrong, and I failed to treat you with the respect you deserved. Rose studied her, her expression thoughtful. I appreciate you saying that, she said, but what I really want to know is why. What made you think I wasn't worth helping? The question hit Caroline like a punch to the gut. She had prepared for anger, even rejection, but not this direct, piercing honesty. I wish I had a good answer, Caroline admitted, her eyes lowering. I think I had biases I wasn't willing to confront, and I let those biases guide my actions. I've been working to change that, but I know it doesn't erase what I did. Rose nodded slowly, her gaze softening. Change is hard, she said, but acknowledging it is the first step. Do you really think this program can make a difference? Caroline hesitated, then met Rose's eyes. I do, and I think it starts with conversations like this. If we can see each other as people, not just passengers or staff, maybe we can start to bridge the divide. As their conversation continued, Rose shared her perspective not just about that flight, but about the countless small indignities she had experienced in her life. Caroline listened, absorbing each word with a mixture of shame and gratitude. By the end of their meeting, Rose's warmth had grown, and Caroline felt a sense of relief she hadn't anticipated. Thank you for listening, Rose said, as they stood to leave. No, Caroline replied, her voice soft. Thank you for giving me the chance to. That evening, Caroline returned home and opened her notebook, flipping to a blank page. She began writing furiously, outlining ideas for a new segment of the training program, one that focused on direct dialogues between staff and passengers. As the words flowed, she realized something important. This wasn't just about fixing her mistakes, it was about creating a ripple effect of understanding and accountability. For the first time, Caroline felt like she was finally stepping into the leader David believed she could be. The passenger reconciliation program had launched, and while some participants found it eye-opening, others viewed it with skepticism. Among the staff, whispers spread like wildfire, with opinions split between those who saw the initiative as necessary and others who felt it was an overreach. Caroline, now fully immersed in the program, had become a focal point for both praise and criticism. While some colleagues noted her growing empathy, others questioned her sudden shift in demeanor, wondering if it was genuine or an attempt to save face. During a weekly team meeting at the training center, tension hung thick in the air. Marcus, ever the pragmatic trainer, led the discussion on upcoming changes to onboard protocols. Caroline sat near the front, flipping through her notes on new role-playing scenarios, when a voice cut through the room. This program feels like a witch hunt, said Gary, a senior flight attendant who had been with the airline for over 20 years. All eyes turned to him as he leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. I've seen more complaints come through in the past month than I have in my whole career. Half of them are probably from passengers looking for free perks. Why should we be dragged through this just because a few people are upset? Caroline froze, her pen hovering over her notebook. She could feel the unspoken tension as others murmured in agreement. David Harris, who had been observing from the back of the room, stepped forward. His calm presence immediately silenced the whispers. I hear your frustration, Gary, David said, his voice steady. But let's be clear. This isn't about punishing anyone. It's about accountability and growth. If complaints are increasing, it's because passengers are finally feeling heard. That's a step in the right direction. Gary's expression hardened. Easy for you to say, sitting in your office. Out on the floor, it's a different story. David nodded thoughtfully, then turned to Caroline. Caroline, you've been on both sides of this. What's your perspective? Caroline's heart raced as every face turned to her. She cleared her throat, her voice steady but firm. I get it, she began. When I first heard about this program, I thought the same thing. I felt targeted. But the more I've worked with passengers, the more I've realized how much these small moments matter. It's not about freebies, it's about dignity. And honestly, this program has made me better at my job. Gary snorted. Not all of us have time to sit in a cafe with passengers and hold hands. The remark stung, but Caroline held her ground. It's not about sitting in a cafe, Gary. It's about taking responsibility when we mess up and learning how to do better. None of us are perfect, but we owe it to our passengers and each other to try. The meeting ended with strained silence, the room splitting into quiet factions. As the group dispersed, Caroline caught Marcus's eye. You handled that well, he said. Gary's always been resistant to change, but he's not the only one. Be prepared, this won't be the last pushback you face. Caroline nodded, his words settling heavily on her. Later that afternoon, David called Caroline into his office. As she sat across from him, he leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. You showed real leadership today, he said, but I can tell the resistance is wearing on you. Caroline exhaled. It's hard to know if I'm making a difference when so many people are against it. Some of them, I don't think they'll ever change. David regarded her carefully. Not everyone will, but that doesn't mean you stop trying. Leadership isn't about winning everyone over. It's about staying the course when you know it's right. Carolyn nodded slowly, his words resonating. I just don't want this to fail, she admitted. It won't, David said firmly, because you won't let it. That evening, Caroline reviewed her notes on the reconciliation program. Among the feedback forms, one stood out: a thank you letter from Rose Turner, the passenger she had met days earlier. Your apology meant more than you know, it read. It reminded me that change is possible, even when it feels out of reach. Keep going, you're making a difference. Caroline sat back, the words sinking in. For the first time in weeks, she smiled. Caroline stared at the email inbox on her screen, the cursor blinking over a subject line marked Urgent. More complaints had come through the reconciliation program, this time from employees questioning its fairness. Some believed the initiative was singling them out, while others felt the program was too lenient on those who had made serious mistakes. Her heart sank as she skimmed the emails, each one piling onto her growing doubt. The weight of the pushback from both passengers and crew was beginning to feel insurmountable. She leaned back in her chair, her mind swirling. Was this program really making a difference? Or was it a doomed effort, forcing people to face truths they didn't want to confront? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the office door. David Harris stepped inside, his expression calm but perceptive. Rough day? He asked, closing the door behind him. Caroline exhaled sharply. You could say that? I'm starting to wonder if this is worth it. Every time we make progress, the backlash seems bigger. David sat across from her, his gaze steady. I get it. Change always comes with resistance. But remember, resistance isn't failure. It's proof that you're challenging the status quo. Caroline folded her arms, still unconvinced. I know, but it's exhausting. And the more I push, the more it feels like I'm losing people instead of inspiring them. David leaned forward. Let me tell you something about leadership, Caroline. It's messy, it's frustrating, and it often feels like you're walking uphill in a storm. But those moments, they're also when real change happens. Caroline hesitated, his words resonating despite her doubt. I brought you into this program because I saw something in you, David continued. Not perfection, but potential. You've already proven that you can change. Now you need to trust that others can too. The next morning, Caroline arrived at the training center to find Marcus waiting for her. His expression was tense as he held out a clipboard. We've got a situation, he said. Gary's been stirring the pot again. Caroline took the clipboard and scanned the details. Gary, the senior flight attendant who had been openly critical of the program, had made comments during a recent shift that undermined the initiative's goals. "He's telling people this is all a PR stunt," Marcus explained. "Passengers overheard him, and we've already had a complaint." Caroline felt a familiar knot of frustration tighten in her chest. She had expected resistance, but Gary's defiance was becoming a serious problem. "What do you suggest?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Marcus hesitated. "You could recommend disciplinary action, but I think it might be more impactful if you handle it directly." Caroline stared at the clipboard, considering her options. Confronting Gary wasn't appealing, but she knew Marcus was right. Later that afternoon, Caroline found Gary in the employee lounge. He was chatting with a few coworkers, his casual demeanor a sharp contrast to the tension she felt. "Gary, can we talk?" she asked, her tone firm but polite. The others exchanged wary glances as Gary shrugged and followed her into a quieter corner. "What's this about?" he asked, crossing his arms. Caroline met his gaze. "I heard about the comments you made on your last flight. I get that you don't agree with the program, but undermining it in front of passengers is unacceptable." Gary's expression hardened. "You think one workshop changes everything? This airline has been running fine for years. All this touchy-feely stuff isn't going to fix what's broken." Caroline took a deep breath, steadying herself. "You're right. One workshop doesn't fix everything. But ignoring the problem isn't the answer either. This program isn't about pretending the past didn't happen. It's about making sure it doesn't keep happening." Gary's posture shifted slightly, his defensive edge softening. "And you really think it's working?" Caroline nodded. "I do. But it's not just about the program. It's about people like you and me choosing to do better. That's the only way this will work." Gary didn't respond immediately, his expression unreadable. Finally, he sighed. "I'll think about it," he said, his tone less combative. Caroline nodded, sensing that this small concession was a victory in itself. That evening, as Caroline reviewed the day's events, she felt a renewed sense of resolve. The program was far from perfect, but every step forward, even the small ones, was a step worth taking. Her phone buzzed with a message from David. "You're making progress, even if it doesn't feel like it. Keep going. Change takes time." Caroline smiled, the knot of doubt in her chest loosening. For the first time in days, she felt like they might actually be on the right track. The ripple effects of the reconciliation program were beginning to show. While resistance still simmered beneath the surface, Caroline noticed a subtle shift in the tone of her colleagues. Conversations that had once been filled with quiet cynicism were now occasionally marked by curiosity. Small gestures like a flight attendant going out of their way to assist a passenger or taking time to listen were becoming more common. But change, Caroline knew, was fragile. It needed momentum, and one wrong move could unravel weeks of progress. Caroline was in her office reviewing new ideas for passenger-staff dialogues when David Harris stopped by. He leaned against the door frame, a folder in hand and a rare smile on his face. "Got a minute?" he asked. Caroline gestured for him to come in. "Of course. What's up?" David set the folder on her desk. "We've been invited to present the reconciliation program at the National Aviation Conference next month. It's a chance to showcase what we're doing and to set an example for the rest of the industry." Caroline's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "That's huge. But why are you telling me?" David's smile widened. "Because I want you to co-present with me." The words hit her like a gust of wind. "Me?" she stammered. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely," David said. "This program is your work as much as anyone's. You've lived it, Caroline. No one can speak to its impact better than you." Caroline felt a mix of pride and panic. She had spent months reshaping herself and her role within the airline, but standing on a national stage felt like a leap she wasn't ready for. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted. David's gaze softened. You can, and I'll be there every step of the way. In the weeks leading up to the conference, Caroline and David worked closely on their presentation. They reviewed the program's successes, highlighted key testimonials, and crafted a vision for how other airlines could implement similar changes. Caroline found herself reflecting on her journey as they rehearsed. Each slide told a story, and each story reminded her of how far she'd come. But doubt still lingered. Late one night, after another round of practice, Caroline turned to David. What if people don't take me seriously? What if they see me as just a flight attendant who made a mistake? David set his notes down and met her eyes. That's exactly why they'll listen to you. Because you're real. You're proof that change isn't just a corporate buzzword, it's possible, even for the people who least expect it. The day of the presentation arrived, and Caroline's nerves were at an all-time high. The conference hall was packed with industry leaders, journalists, and airline executives. As David introduced the program, Caroline stood to the side, clutching her notes tightly. When it was her turn, she stepped forward, her heart pounding. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "I'm Caroline Grant, and I want to tell you a story, not about a program, but about people." She recounted her own experience with unflinching honesty. The mistakes she had made, the passengers she had hurt, and the journey she had taken to make amends. As she spoke, she saw faces in the audience shift from skepticism to curiosity, and even to admiration. "This program isn't about perfection," she said in closing. "It's about progress. It's about creating a culture where everyone, passengers and employees alike, feels seen, valued, and respected. And if I can change, anyone can." The room erupted into applause, and Caroline felt a wave of relief and pride wash over her. As the crowd dispersed, several attendees approached Caroline to thank her for sharing her story. One CEO from a rival airline admitted, "We've been hesitant to address these issues, but after hearing you, I think it's time we start." David joined her, a proud smile on his face. "You were incredible," he said. Caroline smiled back, the weight of her journey finally beginning to lift. "Thank you for everything," she said. David shook his head. "You did this, Caroline. And it's only the beginning." The aftermath of the National Aviation Conference was a whirlwind. The presentation by David and Caroline had sparked widespread interest, with industry leaders eager to learn more about the reconciliation program. News outlets highlighted their work as a groundbreaking approach to addressing systemic bias within customer service industries. For Caroline, however, the real reward wasn't in the accolades, but in the quiet changes she saw taking shape back at SkyPath Airlines. Caroline returned to the training center to find a renewed sense of energy among the team. Marcus greeted her with a grin. "You're a celebrity now," he teased, holding up a printed article about the conference. Caroline rolled her eyes, though a small smile crept onto her face. "Let's not get carried away. There's still a lot of work to do." The truth was, the conference had brought the program much-needed momentum. Employees who had once resisted were beginning to participate more openly, and passengers were taking notice. Complaints about discrimination had dropped significantly, replaced by feedback praising the airline's improved service. But progress was rarely linear, and Caroline knew the road ahead would have its share of setbacks. One of the most surprising shifts came from Gary, the senior flight attendant who had been so vocal in his opposition to the program. Caroline was conducting a workshop for a new group of hires when she noticed Gary lingering in the back of the room. He wasn't on the schedule for that session, but he stood quietly, observing. When the session ended, Caroline approached him cautiously. "Didn't expect to see you here," she said. Gary shrugged, his expression softer than she'd seen before. "Figured it wouldn't hurt to see what all the fuss is about." Caroline raised an eyebrow. "And?" He hesitated, then sighed. "You were right about passengers, about us. I guess I didn't want to admit how much room I had to grow." The admission took Caroline by surprise, but she kept her tone even. "It's never too late to start," she said. Gary nodded. "I'm still not sold on all of it, but I'm willing to try." With Gary's tentative support and the momentum from the conference, Caroline and the initiative team began rolling out the next phase of the program, a peer mentoring system. Experienced staff members would work one-on-one with colleagues to foster better communication and understanding. Caroline was paired with Mia, a younger flight attendant who reminded her of her younger self, eager to excel, but often rigid in her approach. During their first mentoring session, Mia confessed, "Sometimes I feel like I'm walking on eggshells. I'm scared of saying or doing the wrong thing." Caroline nodded, understanding her anxiety. "I used to feel that way too. The trick isn't avoiding mistakes, it's being willing to learn from them." Their sessions became a highlight of Caroline's week, and as Mia grew more confident, Caroline felt a renewed sense of purpose. One evening, David invited Caroline to a small gathering at his office to celebrate the program's progress. The atmosphere was relaxed, with team members sharing stories about their favorite moments since the initiative launched. As the night wound down, David pulled Caroline aside. "You've done amazing work, Caroline," he said, his tone sincere. "I had a lot to learn," she admitted. "Still do." David smiled. "That's what makes you a great leader. You're not afraid to admit when you don't have all the answers." Caroline felt a swell of gratitude, but deflected with a small laugh. "I've had a pretty great mentor." David's expression turned thoughtful. "This program is just the beginning. What we've built here, it's something other airlines are already looking to replicate, and that's because of you." Over the next several months, the changes at SkyPath Airlines became undeniable. The company implemented new hiring practices, revamped customer service protocols, and expanded the reconciliation program to every department. Caroline's role evolved too. She became a key figure in shaping the airline's future, traveling to other hubs to train staff and share the program's success. One day, as she walked through the terminal on her way to a flight, a passenger stopped her. "Excuse me," the woman said, smiling warmly. "Are you Caroline Grant? I read about you in the airline magazine. Thank you for what you're doing. It's made such a difference." Caroline felt a mix of surprise and pride. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. "I'm glad to hear that." As the woman walked away, Caroline paused, watching the bustling terminal. She had once thought her greatest accomplishment would be maintaining order in first class. Now she realized her true legacy was far greater, transforming a culture and proving that change was not just possible, it was powerful. SkyPath Airlines was no longer just a company. It had become a symbol of transformation. What had started as a single program to address systemic bias had evolved into a comprehensive cultural shift, one that resonated not just within the airline, but across the entire aviation industry. Caroline Grant stood at the forefront of this movement. Once a symbol of the problem, she had become a leader in the solution, a transformation that mirrored the journey of the company she served. The reconciliation program had been adopted by other departments, expanding beyond flight crews to include customer service agents, maintenance teams, and corporate offices. Employees at every level were now engaged in dialogue about biases, assumptions, and the power of small, empathetic actions. Caroline was often invited to oversee these new efforts. On one such visit to the operations hub in Dallas, she was struck by the energy in the room as employees brainstormed ideas for making their interactions more inclusive. One of the participants, a senior customer service agent, raised her hand. "What's been the most important thing you've learned through all of this?" Caroline paused, thinking back on her journey. "That change starts with seeing people," she said, "really seeing them. When we stop making assumptions and start listening, we open the door to understanding. And that's where real transformation begins." The room erupted in applause, but Caroline felt more than pride. she felt a sense of connection with the people around her, each of them contributing to a shared vision. Back at the training center, Caroline prepared for a new group of recruits. These trainees were different. They weren't coming into a company weighed down by outdated practices, but one striving to be better every day. During her welcome speech, she shared her story, as she always did, but this time, she focused on what the journey had taught her. "You'll make mistakes," she said, her tone warm but firm. "We all do. But how you respond to those mistakes will define your career and your impact. Never stop asking yourself how you can do better, for your passengers and your colleagues." After the session, Mia, her mentee, approached. "You know, Caroline," she said, grinning, "I think you finally embraced this whole leader thing." Caroline laughed. "Took me long enough." A few weeks later, David Harris called Caroline into his office. She noticed the familiar folder on his desk, the one he always brought out when discussing major changes. "I've been thinking about the next step for SkyPath," he began, his tone measured. "We've built something incredible, but now it's time to ensure it lasts." Caroline tilted her head. "What do you mean?" David leaned forward. "We need someone to oversee this work long-term, someone who understands it inside and out, someone who's lived it." Caroline's heart skipped a beat as realization dawned. "You're talking about me." David nodded. "I want you to lead the Cultural Development Division, not just for SkyPath, but as a model for other airlines and industries. You've proven that change is possible, and you've earned the chance to take it further." For a moment, Caroline was speechless. The thought of stepping into such a role was daunting, but as she met David's gaze, she saw the confidence he had in her. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice steady. Months later, Caroline stood on a stage at an industry-wide summit, addressing a packed audience of executives, employees, and advocates. Behind her, a screen displayed the words, "A culture of inclusion, building bridges through empathy." As she spoke, she recounted the journey of SkyPath Airlines not as a fairy tale, but as a story of resilience and effort. "This wasn't easy," she said, "and it's far from over. But the work we've done proves that no company, no industry, and no person is beyond change. It starts with accountability, empathy, and the courage to face what we've ignored for too long." When the audience rose to their feet in applause, Caroline felt a wave of gratitude. This wasn't just her story anymore, it was theirs. As Caroline stepped off the stage, she was greeted by David, Marcus, Mia, and other colleagues who had been part of the journey from the start. "You've come a long way," David said with a proud smile. Caroline looked at her team, her mentors, and the ripple of change they had created together. "We all have." She knew the road ahead would still have challenges, but she also knew they had built something that would last, a legacy of compassion, respect, and transformation. As she walked out of the auditorium, Caroline felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had turned her greatest mistake into her greatest purpose, proving that no matter how turbulent the skies, a steady course could lead to brighter horizons. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of transformation, resilience, and redemption. Caroline's story shows us that even the greatest mistakes can lead to meaningful change if we're willing to confront them with honesty and courage. If this story inspired you, don't miss out on more heartfelt and thought-provoking tales like this one. Subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. We'd love to hear from you. What part of Caroline's journey resonated most with you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Stay tuned for more stories that will uplift, challenge, and inspire you to see the world in new ways. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.